Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm so glad you've stopped by. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a magic color slider card. So just like this one here, you have an insert that pulls up and you go from an image that is black and white to colored. So I'm going to use a Winterscapes coloring or watercolor stamp set, and I am using some black StazOn to stamp on my watercolor paper. I'm going to watercolor the image, so StazOn is the perfect ink to use. If you choose to use a different method of coloring your image, you could probably change your inks depending on your method. So the first image went on to watercolor paper, the next one is going on some clear acetate, and StazOn is the perfect ink for that. It is a permanent ink and it works perfectly on non-porous surfaces. So I'm going to stamp the image, and then before I lift anything out, I'm going to move my magnet and I'm going to put a little piece of white paper underneath just to make sure I got a clear image on that acetate. And then I'm going to set that aside to dry completely while we're watercoloring the image. So I'm using some distressed reinkers or refills to watercolor my image. It's one of my favorite ways of watercoloring. I love that you can use the refills to watercolor. It gives the one product double duty. So the first color I'm using is Stormy Sky. It's one of my favorites to do a winter sky because it's got a little bit of a gray blue tone to it. So I'm starting with my darkest color behind the trees and the cabin, and then working my way up, and as more water goes into that ink, the color gets a little bit lighter. I'm using a water brush that has water right in the handle, so in order to clean my brush for this next color, I just squeeze a little bit of water and then brush my brush off onto some paper towel. So the next color I'm using is Pumice Stone. It's a really light gray. It's got a bit of a brown tone to it. I'm trying to give a little bit of shadow to the snow. Even though snow is white, it does have areas that are a little bit shadowed, so we want to include that in there. Next, I am using peeled paint for some of the trees, the darker parts of the tree, and then I'm going to use some bundled sage for the lighter parts of the tree. I like these two colors together for greenery. There's just a nice green combination for that. So I am going to blend a little bit of area where I go from the bundled sage to the peeled paint, just so that I don't have just one color and then another color, blending them together. And the nice thing about using watercolors is once the area is wet, you can tap some of the darker color in the lighter area and it just blends on its own. And I'm also going to add some green to the greenery in the top corner. Now some of this image is going to be covered by my frame on the front of the card, but I don't know exactly where that stops. So I'm just going to watercolor the entire image to make sure that I don't have any uncolored area. So now I'm using Hickory Smoke to do the smoke in from the chimney, and I'm doing that right now so that it kind of blends a little bit with the wet background. My next color is Festive Berries. I'm going to use that to create a red cabin, and in the end I decided it's a little bit too bright, so I go back with some mahogany and just darken some of the areas, give it a little bit more shadow, a little bit more of a rustic feel to it. Next, I'm going to use some gathered twigs to color in the pine cones. And I typically go, when there's color or stamps that have a bit of shadow in them, that's where I put the shading, just because it makes the most sense to put it where the darker areas of the stamped image is. If this color was, or if this image was just an outline of a pine cone, I probably would put the shadow on the other side, but I'm going with what the stamp says. So I put a little bit of the same gathered twigs for the branches as well. And then I'm going and getting some fired brick and just putting some red in where that chimney is, and then some scattered straw for the windows, just so it looks like some lit windows. So I have a piece of cardstock here that is 11 inches by 4 1/4. When folded in half, it's going to be a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card. So I'm scoring it at the 5 1/2 inch mark, and I always put my card in the corner of my scoreboard to line up the edges when I'm folding. I have some 1/4 inch strips of matching cardstock. I like doing this with matching cardstock so that you can see, so if you look from the side, you don't see a different color. And I'm gonna put like a U-shaped channel in here, 3 strips high. So you see me putting some 1/8 inch double-sided tape in here. I'm going to take the backing off of the tape, and I'm going to work in with the U shape going from left, bottom, and then right. And then for my next layer, I'll do it the opposite way. I'll go from right, bottom to left, and that way I don't have all the joins from the 3 layers in exactly the same spot. So I do have this sped up, just because this is not very fun to watch. But what I am doing is I'm making sure to line up the cardstock with the outside of the card. That's the part that's going to be visible at the end. So I want to make sure that it looks nice and even on the sides. So when I cut my cardstock for the channel, I want to make sure to go a little bit shy of that fold line I have there. I want to make sure that it folds down still quite nicely. And you'll see that I have, my strips are actually 12 inches. They were just done from a 12-inch piece of cardstock. And I'm just using scissors to snip off the ends. Easiest way to do it, rather than pre-cutting them to the right length or hoping it's to the right length, better to do it all at once. My strips are 1/4 inch wide, but my tape is an 1/8 of an inch. And that's just so that I don't have any adhesive showing for these layers going up. Easiest way is just to have tape that is a little bit narrow. And I am doing the 3 layers because I want to make sure to have a channel that my slider slides in and out really smoothly, and then I have a lot of room for that. And that 3 layers allows that to happen. Now that that channel is complete, I'm just putting in my watercolor, and I do need to trim it off a little bit on the side. So I'm going to take my trimmer and I'm just going to trim it from the side just to make sure that it fits into that channel nicely. My next step is to cut the window out of the front of the card. Now I'm using a rectangle. You could use a square, a circle, an oval, whatever shape you want to use for that. For this particular one, I wanted to see as much of the image as possible, so I chose to do a rectangle. So I'm lining it up, putting it centered between the sides and centered between up the top and the bottom, and I tape it in place so that it doesn't shift to my die cutting machine, and run it through the machine to cut out that window. Using die cuts makes this a super easy task to do. I run it through once and then run it through the other ways just to make sure that it is cut perfectly. And then I'm going to take my paper out of the machine, the die stuck into the plate a little bit there. Now that that window is cut, I'm going to glue in my watercolor image into the back of the card in that channel. I'm just using some liquid glue so that I can move it to the perfect spot if I need to. Sometimes when you put things down, it's not exactly right. The liquid glue makes it really easy to move it around. So while that is drying, I'm going to take my slider piece, and I do need to cut it slightly narrower. I'm just eyeballing it here. If it makes you feel better, you can put it in there and use a pencil to mark it. And I just want to make sure that that slider slides that whole way in the channel. The next step, you need to use a trimmer that has a slide rule, and you'll see that in just a minute. And we're going to take that slider. I'm lining it up with the 1/4 inch mark on the right side of my blade. And I'm starting a 1/4 inch from the bottom and cutting all the way up. And then I'm going to turn the paper over, and I'm doing the exact same thing, starting a 1/4 inch from the bottom and then cutting all the way to the top. Then I'm going to take a scissors and I'm going to snip that little bit off. So we've basically made a T shape with a really wide body. And what this is going to do, those little tabs there are going to be stoppers that are going to stop this slider from pulling completely out of the card. My next video, I'll show you how to make a magic color card with a slider that pulls right out. There's different benefits to each one. For this one here, I kind of like when the slider doesn't pull all the way out, just because you don't, it just keeps kind of the magic of the function of the card. But if you want to pull it out, you can. So now you see me with the trimmer, and I'm cutting a little slot in the top of the card. I started just a little bit less than a 1/2 inch from one end, and then cut a slit about a 1/2 inch or all the way through to about a 1/2 inch from the other end. So we don't want to cut that completely off. We want to cut a slit, and then I'm testing to make sure that my slider fits in there perfectly. Now at this point, I noticed that my trimmer blade was not very sharp. So I'm just going to take a pair of scissors and I'm going to trim some of those paper shaving edges off. And I'll have to get new blades for my trimmer. Now that I have the slot at the top and the slider piece ready, I'm going to take my acetate with the stamped image and I'm going to match up that image with my watercolored piece, and then I'm going to tape it in place. Now when you're matching it up, basically I'm matching up the stamp lines from my watercolor piece and my acetate, and you want to be as careful as possible with this because the better it's matched, the better the card looks. So definitely take your time with this. I'm just using some dye tape to tape it in place, and this will be pulled out later. This is just temporary so that that piece doesn't shift on my watercolored piece. So now I'm taking that same 1/8 inch tape that I used earlier, and I'm going around the window on the front of my card so that I can tape the acetate piece into that window. So you want to make sure to put the tape around all 4 edges. For this part, I'm using 1/8 inch tape. You could also use 1/4 inch tape as long as your acetate piece is big enough. It's just the tape that I had on my desk at the moment. Now take the backing off of that tape to release or reveal the adhesive. And technically you could use a liquid glue here that would glue or that would adhere to the acetate, but the tape is much quicker, much faster, and you don't have to wait for it to dry. So I'm going to close the top of my card over top of that acetate, and I'm just pressing down around the edges of that window to make sure that that tape is stuck to the acetate really, really well, lifting the top up and then pulling those pieces of tape out. And those pieces of tape can be used for another project as well later. And then you see me press down just to make sure that the tape has contact with the acetate there. And then I closed it one more time just to make sure everything was lined up before inserting my slider bit. Now before we actually glue the front and the back together, I'm going to take a pencil and mark where that slider comes out of the top of my card. I want to create a bit of a pull tab there rather than having that entire piece up. So those pencil lines help me to know exactly where to cut. So I'm going to put those pencil lines just to the right side of my trimmer blade, and I'm going to cut along the top, stopping and not cutting at a 1/2 inch mark in the center to create that tab. I cut that part out because I ended up putting my head in front of the camera and you didn't see it anyways. So that's why it's, you don't actually see the whole thing there. But it doesn't really matter where on that top. I just create a spot that's 1/2 inch to create that tab there. And then I like to use a corner rounder to round those edges. You could just use a pair of scissors just to use those to round the edges as well. I just think it looks a little bit nicer. And now we're going to put the slider inside the card and glue the front of the card to the back of the card. Now we're going to put some adhesive on top of those 1/4 inch strips that we had created, that little U shape at the bottom of the card. The tape that I'm using right now is 1/4 inch wide. It fits perfectly on the top of those little strips. And then I'm going to take the backing paper off and close my card and enclose the slider within it. Now, when I originally planned this card, I was going to put a tree die cut in the bottom left corner on the front of the card. And at this point, I realized that that tree die cut that I was thinking of is too big. It's going to cover some of the cabin, and it's just going to overtake the card. So what I chose to do instead was take the snowman stamp from the same set that the cabin and trees are from and stamp and watercolor that and then cut it out. Now, had I thought about this ahead of time, I would have done it all at the same time and had it drying. But in this case, we're going to just have to wait for it to dry quickly before we cut it out so that I don't mess anything up. So I'm using the same colors that I used on the cabin image. I'm using Festive Berries and aged mahogany for the scarf, and I'll also do it for the toque. I'm going to use Pumice Stone for shading in the snow on the snowman. I'm using gathered twigs for the broom handle and scattered straw for the end of the broom. And the only new color that I'm introducing here is I used carved pumpkin for the orange carrot nose of the snowman. And then I'm going to cut it out with scissors. Fortunately, it's quite an easy shape to cut out. While waiting for that snowman to dry, I'm just going to stamp an image or stamp a sentiment in the bottom right hand of the card. I'm just using the same black StazOn that I used for stamping the image, just so it all coordinates together. And I'm just going to stamp it pretty much over where I have my 1/4 inch strips underneath. I really should have done this ahead of time to make sure that I have a nice clear stamped image. Quite frankly, it slipped my mind that I wanted to do that. So fortunately it did stamp perfectly on the first try. If by chance it didn't, what I would have done was stamped it on a separate piece of cardstock, probably white to coordinate with the image, and just make it look intentional and have it framed on the front on white cardstock. Sometimes making mistakes gives us good reasons to be creative problem solvers. Now that the snowman is all cut, I'm going to use some Distress Collage Medium to glue him to the front of the card, and then wait for a few moments for him to dry, and then I will add some Stickles to the top fur part of the snowman hat. This is how it looks before I put those stickles on. Pull up the slider and you go from a black and white image to a colored image. I hope you had fun learning how to do this and it inspires you for some future projects. Hope to see you soon in another video. Please hit the subscribe button and the notifications button to be notified of more videos. And I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for watching. And now the actual finished card with the stickles. I'm not sure the glitter actually shows up on the camera, but it just adds a touch of sparkle to it.